Greetings all, and welcome to Lucas Brews, and welcome back to part 2 of the Tamiya 1/72nd scale FW190 A3 build. Previously, I've covered building and prepping the model for painting, and in today's video we're going to be airbrushing this aircraft and doing it up in the scheme from Jägerschwader 2, flown by Commander Hauptmann Hans Hahn. So without further ado, let's have a paint of this kit. Once the primer had been applied and given 12 hours to fully cure, I decided to approach painting a little bit differently to my previous Airfix 190 by applying a base coat of Vallejo Model Air aluminium. This was mixed in the airbrush with a ratio of 5 drops of Vallejo Acrylic Flow Improver, 8 drops of Vallejo Acrylic Thinners, and 4 drops of paint. I then applied it first in the middle of all of the panels, on both the upper and lower surface of the model, and then did several unifying passes. The aluminium base coat would theoretically make the camouflage colours a bit more vibrant, make applying the yellow markings easier, and I had originally planned to also try using it to create some metal chipping using some liquid mask. Since, however, I had to hold onto the right wingtip of the model while painting, I had to give the paint a few minutes to dry before then holding onto the opposite wing and applying the paint in the areas I'd been holding onto. Fortunately though, this didn't take too long as acrylics dry very quickly. Originally, I decided to try experimenting with liquid masks to create some chipping, although I later on decided against this. I still, however, applied it by dabbing some sponge into the Vallejo liquid mask, and then applying it onto the walkway, leading edges of the wing, and around the cockpit and engine in areas that are likely to receive metal chipping. Next, I decided to experiment with some pre-shading by mixing 3 drops of Vallejo Model Color Flat Black with 3 drops of Vallejo Flow Improver, and then carefully spraying this along all of the panel lines. I wasn't too worried about being super precise, as the effect is supposed to be subtle and very faded, and despite the airbrush clogging, it was pretty easy to do, although I think in future builds I may experiment with some post-shading instead. After all the panel lines had been highlighted, I also sprayed some light random patterning over all the main panels to create a little bit of variation of the paint when it's applied on the top. Learning from my experience airbrushing my Airfix 190, I decided to mask off around where I would be applying the yellow markings, which would be the rudder and the bottom of the engine cowling for the scheme I was doing. By masking around the yellow marked areas, it would prevent any overspray, which would later on lead to discoloration of the lighter camouflage colours. For the yellow, I mixed up 3 drops of Vallejo Flow Improver, 1 drop of Vallejo Thinner, and 8 drops of Vallejo Model Air RLM04 Yellow, and sprayed it lightly onto the rudder and the cowling. Much like brush painting, I find yellow a very tricky colour to airbrush. It's very transparent, so you have to very slowly and carefully build layers up, avoiding making the paint too thick as it can run very easily. I've found that by applying the yellow bands and markings before adding the main camouflage and masking them off rather than applying them after the camouflage is applied, means that they don't end up with a raised lip or edge, and instead appear level and blend a bit more with the rest of the paint job, which is pretty important in this smaller scale. I then gave the yellow some time to dry, and in the meantime cut out, cleaned up, and masked the canopy using some masking tape for sharp edges, and Vallejo liquid mask to fill the rest of the canopy in. At the time, I was working on the Airfix Eduard and Tamiya kits, so I decided to paint their canopies together to avoid wasting paint. I first paint them a coat of RLM66 for their interior grey colours, and once that paint had dried, I then applied some RLM74 over the top, since all of these aircraft had the same colour in that area based on their marking guides. Returning to painting the main fuselage and wings, I removed the masking tape surrounding the yellow markings, and then added it back over the top of the yellow bands to mask them off, and began painting the underside of the aircraft with AK Interactive's RLM76 Variation 1, mixed to a ratio of 4 drops of Vallejo Acrylic Flow Improver, 3 drops of AK Interactive's Acrylic Thinners, and 4 drops of the paint. Initially, I sprayed an overall thin coat in several passes over the entire underside of the model, relying on the previous layers of black to achieve some variation and shading effects, but I probably built up too many layers of the RLM76 as the pre-shading effect was a bit too weak for my liking. On the fuselage and tail, I switched back to my previous technique I'd used on the Airfix 190 by painting the middle of the panel lines for some highlighted areas, before then doing a unifying pass over the whole model to blend it all together. This was better, but still a little bit too subtle for what I was hoping for, so as mentioned, I'll try some post-shading to get some panel variation in the future. Moving on to the upper surface camouflage pattern, I don't really like masking, and I wanted to have some organic and soft looking shapes in the camouflage, like in reference photos of some 190s. So I decided to only mask off the underside of the wings, the fuselage, horizontal stabilizers, as well as the thin line around the wing root to protect them from overspray, as the camouflage is usually sharp edged on these parts, unlike on the fuselage and tail where it blends together. I started painting the upper surface camo with the lightest colour first, mixing 5 drops of Vallejo Acrylic Flow Improver, 4 drops of AK Interactive Acrylic Thinners, and 4 drops of RLM 75. I then applied the outlines of the camouflage shape and gradually filled them in with a few passes. Along the fuselage, the lines are quite thin, so I came in closer with less pressure on the trigger and did a few rough lines around the tail and engine cowling and filled them in. I did another few passes over all of the RLM 75 areas to make them stronger and a bit more uniform until I was happy with the results. Once again, I reckon a bit of post shading for these colours would be better than trying the pre-shading, as they're already quite dark and the black didn't really show through. For the darker colour, I mix the same ratios, but this time use RLM 74 and repeat the process, carefully outlining and filling in the empty spaces, and adding soft squiggles along the fuselage based on the marking guide. As I mentioned in my Airfix video, the contrast between these colours is a bit low, so I did another pass with the lighter RLM 75. Satisfied enough with the main camouflage, I started very carefully adding the mottling shapes to the fuselage side. I realised though that the masking tape was in the way, so I removed it, and found that much like with the Airfix kit, there was a clear mark where the Tamiya masking tape had been, so after adding a few more modelled shapes until I was out of paint, I then switched back to RLM 76 and used some paper to cover over the wing area and carefully sprayed some over the fuselage to blend it all together, as well as cleaning up the overspray from the camouflage and neatening up and feathering the edges of the camo pattern slightly. Doing it at this stage gave me a chance to see how a subtle layer of 76 over the top of the modelling looked, and I thought it looked really awesome. So I returned to the modelling afterwards and added all of the missing shapes with RLM 74 and 75 following the marking guide. Apart from being careful and easing off the pressure a bit, I didn't really do anything too special. I just very carefully added the little shapes I wanted to. My airbrush is the Hasing HS80, which has a 0.3mm needle, so it seems to do both fine detail and larger areas of 1/72nd scale kits pretty well. I have had a few people recommend taking off the outer cover to get even closer and finer detail, which is something I may try in the future, but for this scheme I was pleased enough with how the airbrush performed outside of 1 or 2 clogs. Once all the modelling was then applied, I sprayed a very light amount of 76 over the top of it to give it a faded and soft appearance, as though only a thin amount of paint had been applied like in real life, and with that the aircraft had been painted. Stupidly though, I forgot I'd used the Maskol instead of the chipping fluid as I'd done previously, and attempted to remove some of the paint from the walkway by using water. This obviously didn't really work, and I also decided I didn't feel like further experimenting as I was happy with the paint job, so I decided to make no further attempt to remove any of the Vallejo liquid mask and instead move on to varnishing. I removed the blue tack and masking tape from the yellow markings in the engine, and then sprayed the entire model in a coat of Vallejo acrylic gloss varnish to help seal the paint job and also prep the model for decals. In my admittedly slightly limited experience of Tamiya kits, I've always found their decals are very bad, especially in terms of silvering, so a gloss coat at this stage is very important to try and prevent this. As mentioned, it also helps seal the paint job, which is very important when using acrylics as they scratch quite easily, and it also meant that I wouldn't accidentally remove any paint with the liquid mask. Once applied, I gave the gloss varnish 12 hours to fully cure, before then applying the decals. To apply the decals, I first cut the ones out I would need from the main sheet, and stick them in some warm water, wait for a few seconds until they start to come loose of the paper, and then apply some water to the model where the decals are to go, and slide them off the paper using either my fingers or a brush. The only decal I really struggled to apply though was the white tail stripe, which I felt was a bit too fine for me and my level of experience to attempt to mask up an airbrush earlier, but fortunately with a bit of fiddling this decal did eventually go into place. The print quality of the decals is really good, although they are very thick. Once all of the decals had been applied, I added some Vallejo decal softener to try and combat the thickness of the decals by helping them to soften into all of the surface details of the model. To further help the decals conform and show the surface detail, as well as helping them to stick down, I then applied some Tamiya decal adhesive. This is my usual combo for applying decals, and while it definitely helped, it sort of makes the decals about as good quality as cartograph decals that haven't received the decal softener. You could now see that some of the panel lines were softly showing through, but they didn't really look as painted on or as thin as other brands of decals normally do. So much like with my older BF109 G6 I built from Tamiya, I found the decals once again to be a bit of a disappointment, although unlike in that kit, it wasn't as big of an issue, as I'd purposely chosen a scheme that didn't require the large complex decals like the one with the eagle head. I gave the decals 12 hours to dry before applying some matte varnish to help blend the finish of the decals and paint job together, making it look like they were painted on, and also helping to protect everything from the weathering process, which is what we'll be covering, along with adding the last of the finer details left off the painting in the next video. Thank you very much for watching this video. I do hope you enjoyed it and got something out of it. If you did, please be sure to leave a like and also subscribe to the channel as it really helps out. A massive thanks as always to my wonderful patrons for helping me to not only fund buying these kits, but also the products I use when I make them. If you want to help support my channel that extra mile while also getting ad-free early access to my videos, discounts on my cults page, extra voting power on polls, and also access to some exclusive content, then please check it out. The link will be in the description. All going well, I should have part 3 out next week, and I'll also be releasing a full-length build video which includes all 3 parts in one if you want to watch them all together. Otherwise though, thanks once again for watching, and until the next video, as always, take care and model on.